Today, I want to talk about a second barrier to hearing God's voice. So, again, the question from some people was, why is it that when I ask God a question and I'm listening, why is it that I don't seem to be able to hear his voice? And the number one reason that I talked about a couple of days ago, actually spent 2 days talking about it, was unforgiveness. That is a huge barrier, probably the number one barrier to being able to hear God's voice. So I wanted to talk about a second barrier today, and that barrier is fear. It's a fear that when I hear something or when I ask a question, how do I know that these aren't just my own thoughts, or this is the voice of the enemy, or some other voice that I'm hearing, or some other influence? How do I know that's God's voice? And that's an interesting one. That's one I've struggled with for many years. And so what ends up happening in my own experience is I would talk to God about something, ask God a question, and then I would actually probably was hearing God's voice, but would think, oh no, that can't be right. That's just me thinking. That's just my imagination, or that's some other voice. That's the enemy speaking something to me. And I had this fear that I was going to get it wrong, or that I was going to be hearing the enemy's voice and not God's voice, and therefore make a wrong move or whatever it is. And I think this starts with understanding how to decipher between the enemy's voice and God's voice. But it also has to do with understanding our authority. If you're a Jesus follower, or if you're a Christian, then you have the authority to really tell the enemy to be silent. And so usually if I'm going to speak to God, that's one of the first things I'll do. Is a friend of mine calls this silencing the room or clearing the room, but you just tell darkness or the enemy to be silent. And that's by the authority of Jesus and the authority that he's given you. And you just tell him to be silent, and then ask God to be the only one that can speak, to remove all other distractions, and just give God the permission to be the only one to speak, or ask him to be the only one to speak. And so then you can move forward in confidence. So one is you got to have the confidence that you have the authority to silence the enemy, which you do, but you have to have that confidence. You need to do that. And then you need to be then asking God that he would remove all other distractions, and only his voice, that his voice would be the only thing that you can hear as you begin to move forward in this time of listening. And so that's just a confidence that those things are real, that you have the authority, you have the ability, and that you can hear his voice. So then the other is that as you have a thought or a prompting about something, the question is that my thinking? Is that God? And what I would say is yes, because I think God speaks to us through all of those ways. Sometimes it's so clear that it's almost an audible voice. Now, I don't know anybody that's actually heard an audible voice of God, heard of those things happening, but it hasn't happened with me. But it's very clear, a very clear thought, a very clear emotion, a very clear picture in my mind, a very strong prompting. So I could, in any of those, go, well, that's just me thinking. But again, you have to have this confidence that God does want to speak with you. He wants a walking, talking relationship with you. When you silence the enemy and you ask God to remove other distractions to be the only one speaking, then you have to trust that he is going to speak to you through your thoughts. He's going to speak to you in your heart, in your mind. That may be an emotion. It may be a sense about something. It may be a prompting about something. It may be a thought. And again, I encourage you as you do this to write, because writing, there's actually a scientific thing about when you're listening to God and you begin to write, it actually triggers something in your mind. And there's some really cool stuff that happens. I'll try to get into that another day. It's kind of scientific. So that would be a barrier, is just not sure if this is God's voice or not. And so the enemy loves to cause confusion, so that we're confused about whether we're hearing God's voice or not. So you have to remove that confusion. And that just comes from confidence and faith that God does want to speak to you, that can silence the enemy, that you can hear him. And then, does the enemy sometimes speak? Yeah, he does. I have a lot of friends that if I ask them if they believe God speaks to them, they'll kind of hem haw, and every once in a while I ask them if they think the enemy speaks, and they'll say, yeah, all the time. And so most people do believe that the enemy is kind of whispering in their ear all the time. I believe that to be the case. And so there's this thing of we have to be able to decipher between what God's voice is and what the enemy's voice is. So here's what I would say. The enemy only has a couple tools, okay? He's not real creative. He's not the creator, so he has to just imitate. other things. So he's going to use accusation and condemnation. Those are his two tools. And so if you're praying and you're asking God about something, or just in general, you're having thoughts that are self-accusing, self-condemning, those are the enemy. Also, if whatever it is that you're thinking about and sensing, if that contains any level of fear, guilt, or shame, that comes from the enemy also. Now, this is where some people go, well, what about conviction? God convicts, doesn't he? And yes, God absolutely convicts, but that does not remain in guilt. See, guilt is something that the enemy will take and say, hey, I can't believe you did that. I can't believe a Christian would ever do that, or a good person would do that. And then he takes that and he just beats you with it, right? That's guilt. And we over and over, we meditate or ruminate on these kind of things, when real conviction from God is, yep, I messed up. I confess it. I accept God's forgiveness and I move on. And so again, if it's the enemy's voice, it's going to be condemnation or accusation, or it's going to contain some level of fear, guilt, and shame. And if it's any of those things, you can just kind of go, okay, shut up, Satan. Shut up, enemy. Shut up, darkness. I'm listening to God only, and come back. And so most of the time, my experience has been that God is encouraging. Sometimes there is conviction. Hey, Mark, you're really messing up in this area, or this is where you're getting it wrong. But it's a loving voice. It's a gentle voice. It's not harsh. It's not condemning. It's not accusing. And so many times what I hear God saying to me is, it actually takes faith to hear it and receive it, because many of the things that God says about me they feel too good. They feel too great beyond what I think I deserve, or beyond what I think about myself. And when I hear those kind of things, I know it's God. And also sometimes when it's him asking me to do something that is kind of, you go, really? And a lot of times that's God, because God, I think, pushes us out of our comfort zone. I think God knows who he designed us to be, and sometimes thinks a lot higher of us than we do. Now, we can talk about pride another day. So anyhow, so that's being able to hear God's voice, is understanding that it's that loving, guiding, powerful, encouraging, loving voice. And my friend Jamie Winship, who I've mentioned a couple times, will say this. He says, you know what? It takes no faith to listen or hear the enemy and actually receive what the enemy is saying to you. For example, Mark, you're a terrible father. Man, you're failing at work. You're gonna fail financially and all those things. And we hear those things and we go, yeah, that's probably true, right? See, it takes no faith to hear what the enemy is saying. But many times what God is saying is, Mark, man, I've got great things in store for you. I'm going to do this, or I think this about you. And we kind of go, oh no, no. And we have a hard time receiving it, because it takes faith to receive what God is saying to us. Okay. So here's the big thing though. The biggest thing that I hear is people saying, how do I know that's not my voice or the enemy's voice? Okay. So again, silence the enemy. You can deal with that super quick, couple seconds, move on. God's the only one that can speak. You listen to him. And then the question becomes, well, how do I know that's not my own thoughts or whatever? And my answer is, yes, it's all those things. He speaks to you through your thoughts. He speaks to you in your heart. He speaks to you through emotion, through imagination, all of those kind of things. But I encourage you to write it down. You'll begin to see when you write it down, and then go back and read it and ask yourself, does this sound like something God would say? Or does this sound like something the enemy would say? Does it sound like something God would say? Or does it sound like something I would say? And most of the time when I go back and read it, I go, there's no way I wrote that. Those aren't my words. And so when I wrote that stuff down, I know that was God's voice. And then I have to apply faith. Am I going to receive this and believe that came from God? So I hope that's helpful. I want you to have confidence to be able to hear God's voice and to respond to him. Here's a quick thought. If you go read the story of King David in the Bible, it's really interesting, because as you read that story, every time where David inquired of the Lord, amazing stuff happened. But there's a couple points in the story of David where it says that, and David thought to himself. He didn't inquire of the Lord. So he never went and asked God what to do. He just thought, well, here's the best thing to do. And that's where he got himself in trouble. And so the importance of listening to God's voice is huge. You know what? Tomorrow I want to tell you, or maybe later today, I'll tell a quick story of how God spoke to me the other day and what happened with that, just to give you an example. So anyhow, continue to talk to God, listen to God, trust that God is speaking to you. Take those little things that I told you to decipher between what the enemy's voice is and your voice is, and then apply faith to what it is that God says, and use the tool of writing it down. That'll help you a ton. All right, I'm going to go eat breakfast. I hope you have a great day. See ya.